What's going on, everybody? Just be your boy
DJ Anonymous.
DJ Anonymous on another episode of Sports Biz Music, the podcast. And on tonight's show, I got a very special guest on the show today. I got my boy John Willen on the show. How you doing?
Hey everyone. Yeah, so John Wheeler. I am a data scientist at Lockheed Martin. It's my day job, and I spend a lot of my free time, especially in the fall, doing data science work in college football space, modeling and tracking the journey of each team's resume as they play games, win games, lose games over the course of the season to try to understand how the committee is going to go about ranking teams towards the end of the year.
Wow. So you really pretty much work with data analytics, something that's been very big the last, I want to say, 5 years.
Yeah, so a lot of people don't, there's people, they hear the word data and they think of someone who opens up Excel spreadsheets or who just crunches numbers.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people, when you say, I'm a data scientist, they don't really understand exactly what that means. If someone says, I'm a data analyst, you can get the mental picture of, you sit at a computer, you write code, you crunch numbers. A lot of people think of like a business analyst or someone who's working with a company that just crunch numbers behind the scenes. A data scientist, by definition, you're doing a lot of the same things, but you're kind of more in the art side of the data world than you are in just the number crunching. Like being in data science, you're trying to extract information where it's not readily visible or readily understandable. When you're working at a company doing data science, that's a lot of you're trying to leverage machine learning algorithms or artificial intelligence. You're trying to leverage high complex simulations or statistical models to help figure out ways to drive value for a business or a company. But when I get to do that with college football, it's a lot of trying to find insight through the combination of large data sets or disparate data sources, trying to find unique insights that help tell the story of the college football season that most people just crunching numbers, tracking wins and losses, aren't going to quite find.
Wow, so that's interesting. What I guess so. The first question I want to ask you before we get into the nitty gritty, what got you into being a data scientist, being in like data analytics? Like what attracted you?
Yeah, so this is a part of the podcast that's going to sound eerily similar to when you had Shahan on maybe a month ago, roughly. And he gave a story about how he started his journey through journalism at Baylor in the early 2010s. And I will give a very similar story because I got to Baylor a year before he did.
Okay.
I went to Baylor from 2011 to 2015. So again, prime football, prime Art Briles offense. You're scoring 70 points a game. You've got Robert Griffin winning the Heisman. That was my freshman year. That was 1 year before Shahan got to Waco. My sophomore year, one of my good friends was the starting quarterback, Nick Lawrence, who had led one of my church life groups my freshman year. And then junior and senior year, you win the conference. So, I went to Baylor, not a huge college football junkie, let's say. I was a fair weather fan. My dad liked Oklahoma. They were usually good, so there was some light rooting interest there. But I didn't have some great deep passion for the sport. I went to Baylor at the right time because if I'd gone to Baylor, 5-10 years earlier, I might have left school and still not had a great passion for college football.
Yeah, Baylor,
but I was there at the right time, and just really got a deep desire to follow the sport. but I went to Baylor for electrical engineering.
Mm.
I didn't go there to do data science or to get into data analytics at all. I had gone to Baylor. I did engineering, and I hired out of Baylor at Lockheed Martin on an F-16 radar engineering team. So I didn't get into data analytics just coming out of college either. And so I spent several years doing engineering, still having a passion for college football. But after a couple of years at Lockheed Martin working with radar systems and understanding a lot of fun stuff going on there, doing live flight tests, all sorts of fun engineering things, I got recruited over to a data team so I was getting my master's degree in system engineering through SMU, and one of my professors during that program, he was at Lockheed Martin, also high level Lockheed Martin data guy, and he recruited me over to his team, and that's where I got my first real foothold into what data analytics or data science was. When I was doing engineering work, there was still a lot of writing code. There was a lot of number crunching, but you do that for a different reason when you're doing engineering. It's how do I validate that requirements have been passed? How do I test these parts of a system? And how do I crunch the numbers with the data that I'm getting from these sensors or from these readings internal to the system to understand that? And changing over into more of a business data, sustainment data science role, it became how do I figure out a supply chain and crunch numbers to make that happen based on the data available? How do I model things that allow this company to make more money? So it kind of changes your perspective on how to use data. And it went from taking hard data that's there and trying to provide hard, simple outputs. And it was much more, this is messy data, it's not clean, it's really ugly. And you need to come up with insight that is now adding value to the business. And so it kind of, that opened my mindset. It was very much like working a puzzle instead of following instructions or trying to, follow a simple path to get somewhere. And that really appealed to me, the idea of taking data, not just to answer a simple question, but to try to derive new insight using existing information. So that is extremely appealing to me, someone who just loves solving puzzles and doing things like that are really fun for me. And I was inspired in 2014. Shahan talked about how 2014, when 14-15 football season, when Baylor and TCU both got left out of the first inaugural playoff system, that sparked something in him, an extra passion about his college football fandom. And it had done something similar for me, but in my mind, for several years, I'd carried the idea of, was there any validity to whether or not Baylor and or TCU should have been in that playoff run? And I think in 2017, when I believe 2017 was when UCF went unbeaten and didn't sniff anywhere close to the playoff system. And then they went off and beat Auburn, who'd beaten, I think, both Alabama and Georgia.
Yeah, that same year.
Claimed their national championship since those two teams played for the title. But that year I thought, I'm going to go see if I can find data to better understand. It was my own curiosity, really. I had the idea, is there a better way to understand or figure out who should have been in the playoff? Did the committee get it right? Is there evidence they got it wrong? Which teams aren't getting a fair shake in this system? And so I thought, can I go find data to answer that question? And as it turns out, there is so much, there's publicly available data. There's so many people who have their own systems to try to understand how good teams are, or how good resumes are. And so my thought in 2018 when I first started getting into college football data modeling was can I learn from and borrow from the insights of people who've been doing this much longer than I, and then apply data science techniques that I've learned working at Lockheed Martin and figure out, can I find new insight out of data that people have used and seen for years to help answer the question, burning inside of me about whether or not teams are getting a fair shake in the playoff system. And so I got to start in 2018, refined my processes in 2019 and 2020, made some adjustments for 21 and 22. And, I'm now 5 years through my data modeling experience. I have substantially grown my understanding of just the sport in general and how resumes are built, how to track in data what's happening. And then there are a lot of questions that I still have that are hard to answer. Like this last year in 2020, just about I'd say the vast majority of independent strength rating systems that existed reflected the Big 12 as the second strongest conference on the season. And TCU goes, they play for a national championship. Kansas State gets blown out in their bowl game. A couple other teams get blown out in bowl games. The league as a whole doesn't seem to have that many signature non-conference wins. And you see this just kind of disconnect, I guess is the right word, between what it seems like you're seeing on the field if you just watch the games versus not what one strength system says, but what a large collection of them say. So there's still some to learn about what goes into, if one type of strength, because there's so many different ways to try to understand team strength. If one type of model overvalues a conference or a certain type of team, you can understand that and make sense of it. And if all systems seem like they're overvaluing a conference, then maybe what you're seeing on the field is what's wrong, and it's all the systems that are correct. So I think it's a process. What I do, I look at 50 to 60 independent strength rating systems, and I consolidate. I use those rating systems almost like Olympic panel judges on team strength. So, you go watch the Olympics on TV, you see like figure skating, and they'll have a panel of 5, or maybe they'll have 7 judges or something, and then they'll throw out like the top and bottom scores and take the intermittent 5. And that's kind of what they use to judge each figure skater. Well, I kind of do a similar approach with all of these independent rating systems, where each type of system gets its own vote, and each type of system. So you might have an ELO type system, you might have a Bayesian system, or they're the systems like what S&P plus, or I guess now just SP plus, that Bill Connolly with ESPN provides. ESPN also has FPI, the Football Power Index. There are a lot of other quadratic type systems in play, and some systems are more BCS oriented. They try not to understand the score of the game. So you got all these different types of systems, and several of them in each category. And so it's a process of normalizing and understanding the data for each type, and then each type becoming its own vote for team strength. And so it gives you a lot of interesting insight, but sometimes it tells a different story than what the national narrative for a season is. And if it tells a different narrative for the season than what the people at ESPN are telling, or Fox, or CBS, or whoever else the people who are in in Shahan's role in journalism, trying to tell the story of the season. If they seem to tell a different story than what the analytics tell, that's something I'm really interested in trying to capture and understand. So I can tell a different story that I think is more accurate for why the teams that are going to make the playoffs should be making the playoffs.
Wow, that's a lot. That's a lot, but it is interesting. So I'm glad you brought up, because this was the main subject that I wanted to talk to you about, is that, okay, so the college football playoffs, right? Mm-hmm. Before, you had the BCS, because I'm glad you brought that up too. We had the BCS era where it was nothing but computers. It was no human even a part of it. It was just the computers. They looked at the stats. They look at, they were just breaking everything down. Then we went to the playoffs. And I'm glad you brought up the TCU Baylor. I want to say the incident, because I feel like in my mind, the way things was going that year, both could have went in, but it is what it is at the end of the day, because I can go on for that for hours. But right now in college football, and we're going to talk about the expansion too, how you feel about that. But how is someone that works in data, how do you really break down, how you determine, like, for example, with Cincinnati, to me, UCF probably had the strongest schedule when they went undefeated, but they didn't even reach the college playoffs, the top four. So, in your mind, as someone that just run the numbers, how do you feel about seeing like a Cincinnati going in last year, but not like a UCF?
Yeah, so Cincinnati, they go unbeaten in the COVID 2020 year, regular season, and then they go unbeaten again in 21 and make the playoffs as a result. Cincinnati, they go unbeaten in 2017, beating Auburn, who beat both of the teams who played for the title. Then they go unbeaten again in 2018, and they still don't come close to the playoffs. It's tricky. What I've seen from the committee, the narrative that they tell often is that they are going to select the four best teams, which is what their job is. That's what they're chartered to do, is select the four best teams for the playoffs. Right. But they don't really necessarily select the four best teams on paper. They certainly didn't select the four, or at least they selected the four best teams on paper this year at the moment of the playoff. But after the playoff, you could say on paper the four best teams were Georgia, Michigan, Ohio State, and Alabama, and then Tennessee, and then TCU at 6. But oftentimes what they actually do is they select the four best resumes. And if you go back to from 2014 on, there have been several different chairs of the committee. They've rotated members, every couple of years. And so you kind of hear different talk, it's said differently, but it's some of the same talking points. And if I said that they value the eye test, you would understand what that means. That means they watch the games, they make a determination about how strong they think a team is based on the game they see on the TV or in person. Also, you'll hear them or see them show or reflect, a lot of the analytics, like a strength of record or strength of schedule, or they'll talk about things like game control, which gets more into how they played in a game. So you kind of hear all these different talking points. And I think fundamentally what it boils down to is a blend of the strength that they think a team possesses and the raw resume that team has accrued. And really what the committee does is they blend those two concepts together with a lot of different data points. Shahan, I don't know if he talked about it with you. He did talk about how he had gone through and seen what the committee process was
Yes, he did.
for evaluating teams. I don't know how many of the details he covered late in that podcast, but I remember reading his write-up from that experience, and he talked about how when they're looking at the schedule for each team, there are green dots where there are different ways that they can determine teams. Like if I look at this team's schedule, I can see the strength of all of their opponents on the schedule. And so it's a way for me to understand the value of their raw resume for the season, independent of their own team strength, which I'm going to evaluate based on watching them play, based on looking at all the statistics about them. So fundamentally, it comes down to those two combination pieces. And if you understand how teams are ranked based on those two criteria, a lot of what seem like odd committee rankings start to make a little bit more sense. You look back at 2017 and 2018 UCF, and regardless of what their team strength was, their raw resume pre-bowl game, because you can't know that UCF is going to go and beat Auburn in a bowl game and give them credit for that before the playoffs.
Right.
But before that, their raw resume is very, very weak. And so even if you think you have an understanding of how strong they are, you're still not going to see them as a top 4 team. Maybe you see them as a top 6, a top 7 team who hasn't proved themselves, maybe playing a schedule that any of the top 10 teams that you think exist, you would have projected all of them to have the same record as the top 15 teams or the top 20 teams even. If there were no such thing as upsets in college football and against the 2017 Central Florida schedule, you might have said there are going to be 25 other teams that are unbeaten against that schedule, or 20 other teams. So is it valuable that they won all of the games they played? Absolutely. They avoided the upset. Does that mean definitively that they were one of the top 4 teams at the time of the playoffs? You don't know that. And there's just not enough information. And so that's kind of the committee's MO. You're looking at the data of the games they've played, but you're also looking at how much value is there in the schedule that they've played. And it's not UCF's fault that they didn't have top tier teams in their non-conference schedule in 2017 or in 2018 when they had a similar light schedule, light resume in the eyes of the committee. It's not their fault that happened, but it happened. And so the committee just did not value that schedule. And the same thing happened in 2020 with Cincinnati, who was 8-0, I think, at the time of the playoffs. And they, same conference, group of 5 conference, they had good wins in conference play. But it just wasn't enough to tell the committee that they were definitively a top 4 team. Right. Now in 2021, Cincinnati, I think, had Notre Dame not been an 11-1 team,
yeah, you're right,
Cincinnati probably would have had the same fate in 21 as they had in 2020. Now they might have still gotten in. It would have been an interesting test case for the system if, let's say, Notre Dame goes 7-5 instead of 11-1. Because at 11-1, they almost act as a buffer or a lower bound on what Cincinnati should be ranked as. And at 11-1, Notre Dame was going to be 5th or 6th at worst going into the playoff, which means Cincinnati's 4 or 5 at worst. If Oklahoma State had beaten Baylor, I think Cincinnati probably still gets in over Oklahoma State in 2021, but it's close. And you could understand the argument to flip that because you just don't know. Cincinnati still struggle on the raw resume, even though by the strength numbers, they were just barely the 4th strongest team in the country going into the playoffs.
Yeah, I forgot
last year. So but Notre Dame acts as that barrier, holds them up, and Baylor beats Oklahoma State, so there's not really a challenger for the playoff. You're certainly not putting Notre Dame in over a team that Notre Dame lost to at home. Mm-hmm. So Cincinnati 21, you understand why, but you replace that Notre Dame win with a mediocre but still somewhat valuable Power 5 win, and let's say Notre Dame sitting there at 11-1 mm-hmm. with a not bad loss somewhere else on their schedule, and there's a very real chance that Cincinnati would not have made the playoff and Notre Dame would have. And you can understand why, because understanding again those two core components, the raw resume mm-hmm. that a team accrues, the teams that are in the group of 5 just do not have as much opportunity to build their raw resume unless it is inflated by 1 or 2 substantial Power 5 non-conference wins. And that's really hard. Like, you cannot, the way that scheduling works right now with college football, you can't know who is going to be, if you're a group of 5 team, you can't know who the power teams are going to be 7 to 10 years from now when some of these non-conference games are getting scheduled. And so you can't know whether or not you've scheduled the right team to give you the right boost for you to have a chance to build the resume or to get the resume luck that Cincinnati had in 2021. Like, they scheduled that game several years in advance, and Notre Dame could have sucked, and mm-hmm. they wouldn't have made the playoff again, maybe, depending on what else happened. Let's say Oklahoma State beats Baylor. Cincinnati doesn't have the Notre Dame win. They're not in the playoff. So there's a lot that goes into it. I think, you mentioned playoff expansion. It solves a lot of those problems. Mm-hmm. In my mind, if I were the ruler of college football, I would have created a system long ago where every team playing in every division of football can start the season thinking that if they don't lose a single game for the entire season, they will finish the year as the national champion of whatever division they are in. That would have been my mindset, and that is true for every team in the country who is not playing at the highest level in FBS football. Because in FBS football, until Cincinnati shattered the glass ceiling there, and even still in some cases, mm-hmm. probably the case, in FBS football, there are, like 66 Power 5 teams. Maybe that's not right. Somewhere in the mid-60s, mm-hmm. mid-upper 60s now. Power 5 teams, and everyone else hardly has any chance to win the national championship, winning all of their games under the old system. Certainly under the BCS, even Power 5 teams would finish unbeaten in the BCS. I think 2004 or 2003, one of those early 2000 years, Auburn goes unbeaten, doesn't play for the national championship, and is not recognized. I think it was one of the two USC, years mm-hmm. where USC beat Oklahoma for a title, and Auburn also went unbeaten. It's like Power 5 teams, that used to happen to them all the time.
Right.
And now we expand the playoff to 4, and now that's not going to happen to a Power 5 team. Pretty much every Power 5 team going unbeaten. The odds of 5 Power 5 champs who are all unbeaten is extremely low. So Power 5 champ unbeaten, you're going to have a chance to play for a title. But the group of 5, still, that is a problem. And with expansion to 12, with at least one group of 5 representative, potentially more, but at least one, mm-hmm. You could be a group of 5 unbeaten team now and control your own destiny. You could start every season thinking, I could play my way to a national championship by not losing this year. There's still potentially some problems. Let's say there are 2 group of 5 unbeaten teams, and none of the power conferences produced a low-ranking champ. Mm-hmm. So the top 6 are 5 Power 5 and 1 group of 5 for your 6 conference champions. And then your top 6 at-large teams get in? Is that second unbeaten group of 5 teams going to get an opportunity as a at-large representative? Maybe, maybe not. Depending schedule luck and what kind of resume they were able to build. So there's still some, with my ideal thought, every team has a chance to go unbeaten and win a title. Still maybe some minor edge cases there, but none that we have seen yet. It's exceedingly rare right now that a group of 5 team goes unbeaten. Or I guess 2 group of 5 teams go unbeaten, I should say. So until that edge case pops up, I'm not going to worry about it too much. But that's probably one of the main things that I still am a bit nervous about with the new playoff system. I would have preferred a system where if you are an unbeaten conference champion, you get an auto bid from any conference, and then the top 6 conference champions. And if that unbeaten auto bid team wasn't one of the top 6 conference champions, then that just means there's one less at-large spot. That's not in fine print, and maybe won't ever happen. We'll find out.
Do you think that they will go beyond 12, or they'll just stay at 12?
So they'll stay at 12 for a number of years. I think it depends on how the 12-team system goes. I think initially there's going to be they'll modify the 12, in my opinion, before they expand from 12. And the modifications at play are, home games beyond the first round. That'll be an easy modification. I think a lot of the big schools will push for that. Because the 4 teams that get a bye will want a home game if everyone else is getting home game and home game dollars. So I think that'll be a change that will happen someday, if not before the whole thing kicks off in the first place. I think once a bad team gets a bye into the second round because they were a conference champion, that'll kick off some change. Imagine a year where not 1, but maybe 2 or 3 upsets happen in conference championship games. And that would have happened this last year with both Clemson and Utah getting a bye. So those 2 schools get a bye. What happens if Clemson lost? Well, Kansas State, they're not that far removed. They would have been the number 9 team in the country at that point in time. They would have had a bye. So they were right on the verge. So if someone any farther out from that gets a bye, that's going to create a lot of discontent with the way that is structured. So that's a potential change. I could see. I think before the 12-team system had been proposed or pushed out, my thought was you could go to something like 12 and give a bye to the top 4 conference champions, so long as they were all top 8 in the country teams or something like that. And if they weren't, then you revert back to the top at-large team remaining gets a bye. And that gives you some protection against that happening. I think this last year it would have been 7 and 8 getting byes. So even with that, protection in place, or that idea for a protection, you wouldn't have seen a change with last year's playoff, projected 12-team playoff. But it gives you some protection against like a, 10 in the country or 11 in the country gets a bye, as one of the last 4 playoff teams. I think if I had structured the playoff, I would have done a lot of things differently. But
how would you do?
Those are the things I think they'll change before they expand. They'll get 7 or 8 years into the new TV deal, or the new contracts that they're putting in place for a 12-team playoff. It'll be kind of like the 14. You start in 2014. It's 10 years later that you're really seeing the expansion ball roll. I think it'll be a 7 to 10 year time frame on 12 before they decide whether or not they should expand or will expand. I'm for expansion. I'm for more teams having a shot. But given the nature of college football and how it's different, the distance or the difference between the top teams and the mid-tier teams in college football is a lot wider of a gap than in college basketball.
Right.
In college basketball, a team somewhere around 180th in the country could beat a top 20 team. Maybe not often, but they could do it. And you probably see the mid-tier teams in college football, they don't beat those top teams quite as often, even though it still can happen. So I think given some of the dispersion in the top end of college football, you don't have to go to 32 teams or 64 teams to find out who the best team in the country is, given how short the season is. I think 12 is a good number. I would want to see it at 16 with an auto bid from every conference, kind of like college basketball. And then I would also institute the ability to pick your opponent. So not many people, I'm going to go on a tangent real quick.
Okay.
Not a lot of people watch golf, but there's a good audience for people who follow golf and know what's going on between the PGA Tour and the Live Golf Tour, which is the Saudi-backed breakaway tour. They've taken a number of the top players in the game, formed their own tour. It's team-based competition as well as the individual, which is different than what the PGA Tour does. When the Live Golf Tour, they had their inaugural team championship this last year. They had 12 teams participating. There were 4 teams that got a bye, and then there were 8 teams that played the first day of competition. The 4 teams that won played in the second day against the top 4 teams, and then you get 4 left for the final round that they played. And when they were playing the one team versus one team on the first 2 days of competition, what they did is they allowed the 4 top teams to pick their opponent amongst the bottom 4 teams.
Right.
So on the first day, the highest seeded team, so the team that was 5th out of the 12, they had their choice between teams 9 through 12 to pick the team that they thought gave them the best chance to win and move on. And then the 6th place team would then pick amongst the 3 teams that were left. Technically, I guess Live Golf, what they did is the 5th team could pick anywhere. They could pick any of the teams between 6 and 12. And then the next highest team, which was the 6th team, they could pick from anyone left. And you just do that until you get your 4 matchups. And so it gives the advantage to the team that was the higher seed, as they get to pick the opponent that gives them the most, schematic benefit, or in the golf case, what they think are the players they can beat the easiest. And I would love to see something like that in college football, because there's no guarantee the committee is going to get it right, or that the committee is going to create matchups that you think benefit you. If you're the 5th seeded team and you get the 12th seed in college football just automatically by default, you might think that the 12th seed is a great matchup for you, or maybe you don't. Maybe you think the 12th seed is underseeded, and you really think that the team that's 10th would have been the easiest schematic game for you to go and win. There's benefit in letting you pick which of the bottom 4 at-large teams would have been the most value when you get to the second round. If you're the number 1 seed, and now you're going to play the winner of the 8-9 game. Maybe you're the 2 seed, you're going to play the 7-10. And what happens if the 12th seed wins their first game, and now you've got the 4 playing the 12 and the 1 playing the 8? If you're the 1 seed, who should have the most benefit going into a playoff system, in the NFL, the Eagles, they win their first, or I guess they get the bye, and so in the second round they don't play the winner of the 4 or 5 game. Just automatically they get the lowest seed left, and that's their opponent. But you could think of it in college football because of how few games are played across these teams. You could say the one team should get to play the team that they think is the easiest to beat because they've earned that by being the one seed, whether that's the highest seed left or the team that they think they have the best schematic advantage over. So if I were czar of college football, in charge of the 12-team playoff, something that I would want to see them change, which will not change because I don't think anyone that high up the chain has the idea for it in the first place, is allowing teams to pick their opponent for each of the first 2 rounds. I think that would be a lot of fun to see.
It was, like I said, it's a lot of information, man, and I'm glad you brought up the 16 because at first I thought it was gonna go 16 teams. I
understand why they did it.
Yeah, because the only I feel like my opinion is on that is that I think you got the bowl season. You know, you got the different bowls. And it's gonna, at the end of the day, from what I heard, they want to keep the bowls. They want to keep the tradition. But I do want to hear your opinion though. Like, why you think they ain't go 16 instead of 16? And just left it at 12. Why you think they ain't expanded to at least 16?
So I think there are 2 reasons. One, 16 invites the idea of giving every conference an opportunity to send a champion into the playoff because now it's big enough. You have that plus a large collection of at-large spots available. And I think the general consensus across the power brokers of college football is they don't want teams that don't deserve, based on the full season, to be playing for a national title in the playoff. Also, that reduces the dollars allocated or broken out for Group of 5 teams because the power brokers in college football are going to be the Power 5 conferences. So if you do a 16 team where 10 are auto bid from conference champs, that means a minimum of 5 out of 16 of your teams are going to be Group of 5 teams. So you've got that split of 30, 31 roughly percent of your TV dollars of your playoff funding is going to go to Group of 5. If you do a 16 team with all 10 getting a bid, whereas 12 team, the top 6 conferences get a bid. Maybe in a year where the Power 5 champ is just really bad, that's still, let's say 2 of the Power 5 or the 2 of the conference champ auto bids are Group of 5 teams. That's 2 out of 12. That's 17% of your revenue is breaking out to Group of 5 conferences. So from a dollar perspective, the Power 5 conferences would be disincentivized to expand to 16, allowing the full auto bid for every conference because of how the money would break out. But then, you think about going to 16 with no, just the standard 6 auto bids that you've got right now that they're going to put in place for the 12 team. I think if they expand someday beyond 12, that's what they'll do. But I think they also, the powers in college football, valued the idea of giving the top 4 teams the bye game or the extra advantage. A lot of people who were a part of the stay at the 4 movement, which is the idea that 4 is already a perfect number. We don't need expansion to 12. A lot of those people, rightly so, think that expansion is going to devalue what is already one of the best regular seasons in all of sports because of the impact of each game for the national title race. So you're devaluing the regular season by expanding. So the only way to preserve the regular season value is to create incentives within the playoff that provide additional reward for the teams that excelled in the regular season. So Alabama loses 2 games instead of 1, or let's say they even lost 3, but they still get into a 12-team playoff. There is now value lost for Alabama having lost those regular season games, which now don't mean as much because Alabama still made the playoff. But they lose value in the playoff by playing a first-round game on the road.
Mm-hmm.
So they still get in. So the games that you saw in the regular season that meant so much because, Alabama losing to Tennessee and then losing to LSU, those were so meaningful because the stakes this year were that in losing those 2 games, Alabama lost their chance to play for a national championship. And by 2 overtime or 2 last-second results, let's say, Tennessee winning in regulation on the kick, LSU winning in overtime.
That was crazy too.
It's two last-second results against good teams, and Alabama has now lost their opportunity to play for a national championship. That's a huge stake result, huge stake games, and that's substantially devalued if now Alabama has mulligans because they can still make the playoffs. So how do you create the incentive then for them to win those games, for them to care? Some people might say about those games, which I think is ridiculous. They're going to care about all of their games.
Mm-hmm.
But for the people who feel that way, watching the product on TV, the incentive is the buy game. I think that's why they settled on 12 instead of expanding beyond that, and why they've instituted the buy for the top 4 teams. It gives that additional incentive to win games in the regular season, because now going into the playoffs, you will be one step closer to a national title.
You said everything I wanted to ask. I do have one more question though. Do you see yourself in the committee one day? Like, be for real, because you know so much, and I'm, in my opinion, is that when I looked at, especially like the first couple of years or so, I seen some of the people that was in the committee. I'm like, they don't know football, or they don't even have the study of it, like study of the numbers, study of the data to go through. All right, this team lost by 1 point, like just the scenarios, like for example, because at the end of the day we have the, what they call it, the visual test. You see, like, okay, how they perform, but we also have now the data. You have to see, like, all right, for example, Alabama this year. Alabama, I already knew they wasn't going to the playoffs regardless, was because to me they wasn't the high performance offense like they used to, and their defense just fell off. And then you look at the numbers of, like, this was probably Saban's most undisciplined team I ever seen, this year, with the amount of penalties. But by you doing your studies, because you done a lot of your studies, do you see yourself in part of the committee? Like, let's say the committee call you one day and they say, "Hey, we want you to be part of the committee." Would you join?
I think, I'll answer it a couple different ways. Obviously, if someone called me and said, "Hey, we'd love to have you as a part of this process, trying to understand, in a more formal way," I'd be all over that. I'd love that kind of opportunity. That said, I think the real question is whether or not the committee will let someone who is an analyst not just provide information, but actually be a part of the decision-making process. And I doubt that will happen. There are analysts who support the committee already. I think I forget the company, but I know they contract out to an analytics firm to try to capture meaningful data for them to make the right decisions from. They do use a lot of data, but they aren't beholden to the data that they're seeing. They still give themselves the leeway to overrule data that's available, which sometimes leads to, some of the conflicting statements that you'll hear from the committee. They'll say really odd, bizarre things sometimes. So I think if your question is, will they let someone in analytics not just provide insight but be part of the decision-making process, unless that person was in analytics and then transitioned into more of like an administrative role with a university or with a conference, I don't see that happening. If you had a committee that was 100 people trying to make the decisions, that'd be too large for them to really coordinate. But you would have space for people who were outside of the power structure of college football to get involved. But given that is not feasible from a communication standpoint, the way the committee is structured right now, I doubt you'll see that happen. Now, also, how important is that? Having the right analytic mindset and understanding in a 14 playoff, it's extremely important. But how important is that in a 12-team playoff where every team has an opportunity to win their way in, regardless of what the committee thinks? And then, if you missed out, if you didn't win your way in, every one of the at-large teams, sans potentially Notre Dame, would have lost. They would have either lost their last game of the season going into the playoffs, or they wouldn't have even played for their own conference title. So those teams who now miss out on the playoff in a 12-team environment, the teams that miss out of the playoff will have only themselves to blame, as opposed to blaming the committee for getting it wrong, because those teams either didn't even get to play for their conference title, or they lost their conference title, or their Notre Dame. So I think the stakes with expansion are decreased from that perspective. There's more opportunity to own your own path into the playoffs. And because of that, maybe it doesn't matter as much if the committee gets it exactly right every year. But then again, would I love to see an analyst have a voice in the decision, not just providing insight to the room, but having a voice in the discussions and the decision-making process? I think it would definitely shape some of the findings they have differently. Some of the things that they say that don't make sense would probably make more sense. They would talk about it the right way. Like sometimes you hear them talk about things and you can understand why they did something, and you can understand what they're trying to say, but they don't say it correctly. And so you end up, or they end up sounding silly, trying to make points that don't quite make sense. One example, this year, back when it was either the very first ranking or the second ranking came out, and Gary Barta, no, that's not right. Who is the chair of the committee this year? Trying to remember. Last name starts with a C. But anyway, the chair of the committee came out and kind of gave his spiel on TCU. A lot of the things that they thought about TCU, the first ranking, TCU is way down in the ranking. And a lot of the statements that they made about TCU just statistically were not correct. And I thought it was really odd that they had gone through and they'd done all the analysis, they made all the findings, and then they kind of blew it on the explanation. I think if they had an analytics expert in the room, that would help them with some of their own explanations. It would help them talk to how they got to the decisions that they made more often than kind of what you hear, especially early on in the process. By the end of the season, usually it's pretty easy for them to do their job finding the top 4 teams, but maybe they struggle deeper down in the rankings, explaining why things are the way they are. But early on in the season, which matters because you're telling the narrative of the season, these are the teams that are in a spot to make the playoffs at this point in the season. And I think that's where there's some disconnects often. But yeah, original question: would I love to be more involved in the formal decision making process? Who wouldn't from the analytics community? Am I happy with what I'm doing right now, which is trying to sift through the data and understand resumes in a way that's easier to digest than what a closed room committee discussion is going to come up with? I'm happy with where I'm at. Each week during the season, I can go through and help the people who are following along at home understand where their teams are at, what resume value they've picked up by winning the games they've won, how much of a setback was it to lose to a team that wasn't as good as them, how strong are they on paper, not just from one system that seems to have flaws or biases, but when you kind of normalize all of your data and try to understand the big picture, how strong are teams really, and where does your team fit in? And when you kind of put those two perspectives together, where do you really stand in the pecking order? That's where I'm at. That's what I'm trying to do. Most everything I do, for those who are wanting to find or follow along, is on Twitter, over at CFP Resume Ranks. It would be rankings, but Twitter has a character limit. So CFP Resume Ranks over on Twitter. And then we've got a website where we'll post a lot of the behind the scenes data that helps us get to the rankings that we come up with.
On that note, thank you for coming on the show. But I want to say this though. You have so much information, and I usually don't say this about my guests. I probably said it a couple times, but I would love to have you, especially when college football come around. I would love to have you on the show to have some type of weekly segment, especially about when they get closer to the rankings with college football and everything. But also, really, like you said, the most important time of the schedule is the beginning of the year. People don't realize that because you got the non-conference games. People look at that the most, and then maybe the first couple or two not conference games. So, if you open to that, we could talk about it off of air. But really, truly, I would love to do that, some type of collaboration. Because
absolutely, I'd be happy to join in. Always happy to talk about college football. Always happy to talk about resume rankings, the fun things going on behind the data curtain, if you will, within college football.
Because the way you breaking everything down is first of all, you making my job easier for me because usually I gotta ask questions and stuff. But I'm it's like I'm really in the classroom learning the other side of college football, especially the analytics, the data, the true. A lot of people may not want to hear it, but it's true. If I had 10 college coaches right now from Power 5, I guarantee you they'll sit down for an hour and just listen to you on how you break everything down. You know why? Because that's gonna help them, prepare for the next season. Because the goal is to win a championship. So man, you got a lot of talent.
I'd say there are a lot more than me who have expertise in college football, statistics. A lot of the folks I really admire who I borrow from their work when trying to sift through and find the right insight for me for what I'm doing. There are people like Bill Connolly with SC Plus he has so much insight because of his own modeling system. Jeff Sagrin, who was a part of the BCS but has his own, he's been in the modeling space trying to understand team strength before the BCS even existed. There are all sorts of other, Peter Wolf, Kelly Ford, one of the relative newcomers, does a lot of great work. He's got his own analytics and podcast, and it's worth a follow. He does a great job of breaking down some of the data he's looking at. One of the big things you see people trying to get into college football data analytics to support gambling now and betting. That's a big boon right now if you can find analytics to help you make the right bet when you're predicting games. That was one of the things I started slowly getting into this last year, not just so I could make profit off of it, but more out of curiosity, trying to take the data I have and project forward. Andrew Percival, he's got a huge collection of folks providing insight for picking college football games that he tries to track through a pretty large Tableau dashboard that's publicly posted. And I think out of from when I started tracking my against the spread results this last year, there were like 14 or 15 systems that he had been tracking that I was close to the top of on the pile. That doesn't mean I'm going to be able to do that well next year. There's a lot of refinement to make in the analytics space for folks getting into betting, for folks getting into straight up picks, parlays. There's just a lot of interest in data analytics, and there are a lot of people who've been around a lot longer than me that are all worth a follow for someone who's trying to really understand more about what happens in college football than the narrative that you see when you turn the TV on each Saturday. There's just so much more going on, and it really opens your eyes to the beauty of the sport when you understand what happens behind the scenes, when you understand the data that's going on that isn't broadcasted or isn't part of an ESPN graphic. It really makes the sport fun to follow.
And I just got into this too, sports betting. It like for me, I'm not like on your level when it comes to analytics and stuff, but when it comes to numbers, I like to bet on individual players. I don't really like the whole team because you got to depend on too many stuff going on. But I like to bet on they call it props. I just like for me knowing college football. Like for example, I bet it was like a 5-player parlay. It was Shroud. What's his name? Max Duggan from TCU.
Yep, Max Duggan, TCU.
Of course, it was the QB from Alabama. It's because it's late. Bryce Young and the quarterback from Tennessee. So like I like because every week they're not guaranteed to go over 300, 400 yards, but I look at the opponents, and it's just like the football in me too because I played football. So I'm like, okay, TCU going against West Virginia, they defense is terrible. So especially they secondary. So I'm like, all right, let me go over with Max Duggan. I think at the time it was like go over like 230, I think it was 270 or something like that. And he went over. I think he had like 330 that game or something like that. But it was like late because they was losing. So, I mean, you're not the only one. I just started like betting heavily. It's fun. Because I've been doing fantasy football for years, and like someone just kept telling me, just bet, and I did it. And people would ask me like, how you got all these, like how you win a lot. Because I don't win a lot now, but when I'm on the streak, I said I just look at You gotta look at the numbers. You gotta look at the situations. But that's something like people don't understand. Like people that betted before me, like people that's like been betting for years. That's been especially in sports. I tell them all the time. I give them so much respect because you really have to be patient. It's like doing homework. Like you really got to sit down. You can't just place a bet just to place it. You gotta be like, all right, let's see what I gotta go back. You gotta go back years, like before. Like, all right, he played this team. How he played them last year, 2 years ago. Like, it's a lot. It's a lot, but it's fun though.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the people who set the line, they've got so many analysts behind the scenes doing the exact same thing that you would be trying to do as a freelancer. But if that's something that's interesting and fun, it's more fun when you at least have insight into what's going on behind the scenes.
Yep. And before we end the show, do you have any like recognitions, any shout outs? Anybody you want to?
No, I think if you thought anything I said tonight is interesting, come find us over at CFB Resume Ranks on Twitter. Give us a follow. If you like college football and you want to see more than what's going on with the ESPN or the Fox product that shows up on Saturday, and you want to better understand the season, start hunting. There's data out there. There are people who break down data out there. I'm one of them. There are a lot of others who do that, and they can make the season a lot more fun for you. And if you are interested in the analytics, whether it's for college football, any sport, or anything in life in general, my encouragement would be to just start with something simple and don't be afraid to make mistakes along the way, because you do not have to be a master programmer to do heavy analytics things. There's a lot you can do just in Excel without having to get into a coding environment. Most people can get into Excel, make a table, and Google how to do something with it. And so, when I first got into analytics, I had a lot of support, a lot of learning, a lot of Googling how to do stuff. And most people who get into the analytics space or who get into data science, their best friend is the Google search engine, because no one person, when trying to do something complex with analytics, is going to have every answer for how to do that complex analytics thing. So those are my encouragements. Either come find us, get involved, find others who help break it down, or if you're just interested in the analytics period, start simple and don't be afraid to make mistakes.
Yep, and on that note, this has been your boy
DJ Anonymous.
DJ Anonymous for another episode of Sports Biz Music with my boy John Willer, which I thank you again for coming on the show. And I say the offer's on the table for the for the new season, okay? Please.
We'll see you again. Thank you, DJ.
All right, y'all. Be safe. Peace.